Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're doing the last of a series of lectures on teaching reading, and we're taking a slightly different tack today. We're going to look at teaching reading in the new media age, or teaching English in the new media age, and what that might mean. And when I think about where English method units were when I was in your shoes, learning how to be an English teacher and at uni and finishing my teaching qualification, this was not a topic that was on the agenda. This is a new topic. So some of what we're doing today is about what's changed in the advent of new media. So the first mass-produced iPhone was 2007. So a lot of people date the onset of what we think of as new media from that time, smartphones in people's pockets. Some people date it earlier than that, the advent of the internet, mass uptake of the internet about mid-90s. Some people date it earlier than that, the early forms of the internet like listservs and bulletin boards and things like that. Depends how far back you go, Morse code. But certainly this topic, the idea that there's something different going on in the textual landscape that has an impact on what we do as English teachers, this is a relatively new topic. So some of what we're going to do today is talk about the newness, and some of what we're going to do today is talk about things that aren't really that new, or they're old wine in new bottles, sort of some of the same ideas in slightly different formats. So I'm going to talk for a bit, and then Kristen's also going to be speaking with you today about some of her ideas around teaching English in the new media age. So today we're going to look at a bit of context, the landscape, the textual landscape and digital media use in Australia and elsewhere. We're going to signal to you some of the debates and issues associated with teaching with new media, or teaching in an era where new media is more or less ubiquitous. And we're going to ask you to think about, what do we as English teachers, people trained in specialised ways of reading and using texts, what do we have to add to this debate? And part of our argument today is that we can actually bring our disciplinary perspectives to what seems to be something perhaps not related to English, people's use of devices and things like that. And we're arguing today that actually there is something that we can add to this discussion from our disciplinary perspectives. Also helps us think a bit more intelligently and with nuance about what we might do with new media in our English classrooms if we remember what we already know from our disciplinary perspectives. And this is not the first time we've introduced this concept to you, but we will finish talking about affordances, which is a media way of talking about the capacities of different media to do different things. So before we embark, there's two kind of key ideas that we're putting before you today. One is that we can have critical perspectives on technologies and the use of technologies and texts in classrooms. And to do that, we have to sort of start thinking about not just the device, but what else is going on, text in use, devices in use, and this idea of a deep disciplinary perspective on new media that we can bring to the table when we're in staff rooms and discussions are underway about the use of technology in classrooms. We have something to contribute from our own perspective. All right, so what do we mean by new media? So a lot of people talk about the advent of Web 2 as one of the things that really changed the landscape. So before Web 2, web pages are sort of more or less static, text-based productions, whereas with the advent of social media, YouTube, Twitter, that sort of thing, the content of the internet is generated by the users of the internet. So it's not just people in Silicon Valley who have control, it's, in theory, anyone who has the device and the aptitude to blog, to post online content can do so. So there's this idea of a democratisation effect. But of course, there's also an opposite effect, which is the very high concentration of power into a few companies, and a few media companies such as Google is also sort of paradoxically another effect of this. So we've got a different textual landscape to the landscape we had even in, say, the 1990s. So what does this mean for the young people coming through our door? It means that before they've come to your pastoral group at 8:30 in the morning, they've already checked their social media. And in fact, you have probably too. So what does this do to how people relate to each other, how people construct identities, how people use media to communicate, to shop, to vote, to influence, to stay in touch with friends, to do banking? They're now all mediated by screens. All of us are using screens for hours every day to do our day-to-day practices. So that's a radical change from, say, 20 years ago. But if we take a socio-cultural view, we see these practices in context in relation to relationships, power arrangements, what people are actually doing with them in their day-to-day life. So it's very easy to look at like the phone or the latest app and go, wow, that's amazing, and look at it in isolation. But a socio-cultural view says, how are people actually using that in their day-to-day lives? What does that look like on the ground in relation to what people are already doing? So what account, if any, should English teachers take of this when we're planning our curriculum, when we're relating to our students, when we're thinking about the content, if you like, of our subject? And are there more or less productive ways of thinking about this, the relationship between English teaching and new media and technology? What are the options before us at this moment? And we know that things will continue to accelerate and change in what's called liquid modernity, where we are now. We can't predict what 20 years from now will look like. This is quite different to earlier generations where they were expecting change but not as rapid as we are now experiencing. Here's some more context. This is a 2015 Global Attitude Survey from the Pew Research Centre. And it's a map showing % of adults who use the internet at least occasionally or report owning a smartphone. And one of the interesting things that comes out of this is Australia is really quite saturated with internet use and smartphone use. So the global median is 67%. We have 93% at 2015. We could probably guess that it's gone up even more since then. We're only second to South Korea in our internet use and smartphone ownership. And there's some surprising figures in there too, like France is 75. So there's obviously uneven uptake of these technologies across the Western world. This is from the same research centre. They show smartphone ownership. Adults who report owning a smartphone, cell phone, but not a smartphone or no cell phone. And we get a sense of what's sometimes called a digital divide, where we live in a world where we're only second to South Korea. Again, 77% in 2015 owned a smartphone, another 16% a cell phone, only 6% no phone. So we're actually one of the most digitally saturated societies in the world in terms of people's smartphone usage. And this has really interesting ramifications for us. There's lots of texts and practices and ways of being in the world that we're actually uptaking very rapidly in Australia. And we'll come back to some of the anxieties this has produced. So what are some of the effects? Well, already people doing research in this area have noticed some effects of this. One is the blurring of the public and private worlds. So there's a sense that because we post online and we do things online, that what was once private endeavour is now part of the public space. And we all know that our data is being used all the time now, where we click, what we shop, what we look at. So the blurring of the public and private has occurred as a result of this, and there's then ramifications politically about that. There's how our sense of ourselves is being shaped. So I taught at a girls' school, and they talked to me a lot about the effect of Instagram and the idea of being Instagram-worthy as a hot body how that affected how they felt about themselves. And the generation of selfies, and at the time, the pursuit of likes. And if you had only 10 likes by recess, you would take your photo down and feel terrible. So this has an effect on people's view of themselves. Conversely, how we already relate to each other gets played out online in different ways. So it's a two-way traffic. So our identities are tied up in these texts that we produce online and we consume online. So it's not just about the device. The device is in a kind of an ecology of relationships, people's location, people's power, people's how they relate in terms of gender and race, geographic location, class. These are all sort of relatively important things to be considering. This is an old ad. Remember interactive smart boards? They were going to be like the next big thing in education. Who's taught with one? Has anyone taught with one? So this is an old ad, and it was when smart boards were still first hitting the market, and it was in a trade publication, the kind of magazine it ends up on, staff room tables at schools, and there was huge hype about these interactive whiteboards. They were going to change the way we taught, they were going to allow us to do all kinds of amazing things in the classroom, but that anticipated uptake didn't happen. And it's really interesting looking at this as an example of how technology is marketed to teachers and the kinds of claims that are made about technology to education people. We've got here something called electro board, and there's kind of a sort of Jetsons futurism going on here. It's kind of, wow, electro board. And we've got a teacher standing at the front, kids sitting in rows, hands up, and a boy at the front, for some reason drawing an arrow to Jupiter. I don't know why he might be doing that, but there you go. And there's a whole discourse here about an understanding about what it means to teach and learn. The grammar of schooling is still intact, what we call the grammar of schooling. The recognisable patterns of behaviour is still intact in this advertisement. There's a teacher standing at the front, there's some content being shown, and there's students putting their hand up. So the only addition has been the technology. So this portrays some of the thinking around technology in the classroom, that if we just add a technology, add a device, that somehow suddenly the kids will be really engaged, you'll be able to get through the content easier just from adding this technology. And there's also an understanding that what matters in education is getting through the content, delivering information. It's just a different way of delivering information from you to the kids. The conduit is the technology, and it just does it better than a book. Is this the only way we can think about technology? I would suggest not. Here's another one, an interactive projector from Epson. Simple to use interactive projector in one hand, students in the palm of the other. So there's a whole lot of values here around what the actual agenda is. He's got, I mean, what is that? It's a drawing of what, a plant with some roots. The kids, yeah, they look really engaged. Like one hand's like, her arm's hanging down, like, oh, okay. So there's this whole kind of ethos that what really matters is, in this case, controlling the kids. That technology is going to allow you to somehow control the kids. But where are the opportunities here for them to be constructing meaning, constructing understandings? Where's the opportunity here for the teacher to actually devise some kind of curriculum where they're doing something other than looking at a whiteboard? So these are some early iterations of this sort of technology and how it was marketed to teachers, but we're proposing that we could probably think about it in a bit more sophisticated ways. And then there's another point to be thinking about, which is technology, in a way, has always been in the classroom. It's just had different guises. The wall stapler, when that was invented, was a boon for art teachers, because then they could start putting things up. So when we think about technology, we tend to focus on what's new, but technology has actually been around in a form like slates for quite some time. So we've got two essential ideas. We need a critical perspective on technology in the classroom and new media in education. And we can, as critical professionals, bring that perspective to discussions in our schools. We can get past that sort of Jetson-esque gee whiz kind of factor and think about, well, what really is at stake here? What kinds of learning do I want my students to be engaged in? If so, then what does the technology do? Does it do anything for that or not? It might. It's possible it does. Then there's the English teacher perspective, the other lens, a deep disciplinary perspective. What is English teaching about? What am I trying to do with my students? What does new media have to do with that? Can I find some kind of common ground between those two? So when we think about new media, we tend to think about the latest device. But this fellow Edgerton, he wrote a book called Shock of the Old. He says, when we think of information technology, we forget about postal systems, the telegraph, the telephone, radio and television. When we celebrate online shopping, the mail order catalogue goes missing. A history of how things were done in the past and of the way past futurology has worked will undermine most contemporary claims to novelty. So this is interesting. A lot of what we do online is actually just a lot of stuff we used to do offline. Banking, looking for a share house, posting a message to someone. So this then gives us a critical perspective. Like a lot of what is hailed as the new, in many ways, is a reconstitution of what we've already done. So it's easy to think of the device. People tend to focus on particularly young people and phones. There's a lot of discussion about young people and their phones. And so we look at the thing in people's hands. But what we lose sight of then is what people are doing with it. So what I'm suggesting is that we can look at the technologies. But then in looking at the technologies, what texts are people producing through those technologies? What artefacts are people making? What kinds of textual practices are people involved in that are augmented or facilitated by that technology? So some of it is new, okay? Something like social media, that's a fairly new form. But then we look at the textual production of that as a text in the same way that we might a 19th century novel. And incidentally, a 19th century novel was written as a social form in a serial in a magazine quite often. And then we look at the practices, what people are doing in their day-to-day lives with those technologies, with texts that they produce. What kinds of relationships are being formed, what kinds of communities are being made. So that the technology then isn't isolated, it becomes part of a network of things that we're looking at critically. And as English teachers, we're interested in this, meaning making with and through language. And as English teachers, we're often concerned with students producing certain kinds of literate identities. We want them to take up a self. We're trying to help them cultivate a certain kind of literate identity. What kind of person is going to be a successful student of, say, Shakespeare? That's a kind of identity. And then how does that relate to these texts and technologies that we're producing? These are the questions. For instance, if we look at this through our English lens, we've got Greta Thunberg and her profile on Twitter. And what we can see is, okay, this has been produced using technology, but what is also going on is the cultivation and promotion of a particular identity in a network of other identities. How can we analyse this as a text? What are the formal features of a Twitter account as a text? How might someone's profile on such an account relate to what we already know about how an author produces a character? What are the relationships between the strategies a creative writer uses to produce a character and how people produce a character of themselves online? How does this relate to questions about community building, politics, discourses and counter-discourses, struggles over the meaning and direction of public life? These are all things that English teachers are concerned with. So we might say, in a unit on where we're looking at media, put a text like this before our students as a text that can be analysed just as much as an editorial or a letter to the editor or a feature article. And we can use our English teaching training to get our students to think critically about these sorts of texts and how they circulate in our world and do things in our world. So I'm sure you're aware that on Friday there was an enormous climate strike in Melbourne and around others around the world, of which Greta Thunberg is sort of a figurehead of that movement. So there's work being done through these technologies that is unprecedented. But how can we as English teachers help our students grapple with this and think about it critically? There's also online fan fiction. We often struggle to get students to write creatively in our classrooms. Meanwhile, there are thousands of people writing to a public online and getting feedback from other writers. Newcomers are as welcome as old hands. EAL learners are using this to write in English and practice their English writing. And you get an online community around the practice of writing, a traditional practice, a traditional literacy, but it's appearing in a different way. I was very interested to see that Outsiders has 9.6k stories associated with it, which is interesting to me because that's like a text that we tend to teach in English as compared to some of the others which we would say are sort of fan texts only. We don't teach mortal instruments that I know of. I don't know of anyone teaching mortal instruments in a school. So this is ironic for us as English teachers. There we are struggling to get students to produce some writing, and meanwhile there's these flourishing writing communities outside of school. What does this suggest to us about how the affordances, the opportunities that media provides people actually aids with literacy learning? So if we go back to the Stellar standards, there's one point we might think about how we take account as English teachers of all this new technology. A statement in Stellar is, English teachers aim to teach students to become discerning participants in the diverse cultural activities that constitute their daily lives. Now, if people's interaction with screens and new media is actually part of their daily lives, then that suggests that we need to have something to say about that or interact with that in some way to enable students to become discerning participants. And sometimes they are discerning participants already in ways that they can bring to the study of The Handmaid's Tale or Great Expectations, that there's a crossover effect. You can recruit those skills they already have. Being a discerning participant, of course, does not just mean consuming, it also means producing texts. This is where we can encourage our students to be involved. But of course, it's not just the positive story that gets the media attention. So for those of you going into your first paid jobs next year, you're going into schools where, as of that year, mobile phones are to be banned in schools. Is this something we knew about? Yeah, were they talking about it on placement? Yes, so we've got, as a problem with any blanket application of a rule, you've got situations in which it doesn't seem called for, where people arc up against it because they think, well, hang on, you're taking away our ability to decide whether or not we're going to have phones in our school. It's been made a law or a piece of legislation or what have you, so that that choice is taken away. So there is some research that having a mobile phone for a student who's already high achieving doesn't actually affect them. The students who are already low achieving, having a mobile phone does affect them. So some people have argued this is an equity thing, so that the argument is we can lift achievement by taking away the phones of the low achieving students, but by making it blanket, because you can't say, well, you're a D student, you can't have a phone. So making it blanket was a way of making it fair, but then it also presents problems about, well, we might use phones in our classroom for particular curriculum uses as well. Yeah, and some of the arguments around the ban were about pastoral things to do with cyberbullying, which happens outside school hours, so as well as in school hours. So you can't actually control people's phone use outside school hours. So these are some of the issues that have come up that there's a lot of public anxiety around mobile phones in classrooms for a variety of reasons. The OECD data has suggested that there's a correlation between the amount of phone use and phone ownership in OECD countries and decline in results in PISA. So the countries with more phone use are getting worse in PISA data. It's a correlation though. So, you know, are smartphones making kids dumber? If they are, they're definitely making adults dumber then too. It's not like they're a different species. They're just young versions of us. It's the same brain. So that opens up a whole lot of other questions too. But there tends to be moral panics around young people and phones too. Okay, just lastly before Kristen comes on, is the issue of online learning as packaged learning. So when the Gonski review, the Gonski 2 review came out, there was a lot of use of the phrase personalised learning, that the Gonski review was advocating personalised learning. Now, personalised learning means something different than what people think it does. It doesn't mean a teacher sitting down in the way that was being used there and the way it's used in ICT. It does not mean that Myra sits down with all 25 of her Year 7s and has a discussion with them about their progress and personalises the learning for all 25 of them. It means the pathways that you get through an online learning system depending on the answers you give, and it sends you down various pathways according to the answers you give on different. So personalised actually means the response of a software to what you put into it. When you explain that to non-educationalists, they go, "Oh no, that's not what we want." But that's what it's actually meaning. So in Brooklyn, students were protesting against the use of Summit Education, which is an online package that was being rolled out in their schools, where all the curriculum was online, and the teacher was a facilitator of that curriculum. And the students, after a little while, found that they were not enjoying it at all because it was not personalised, and they actually missed the relationship with the teacher and the teacher making curriculum in response to where the students were at. So the human factor was sort of being pulled out there, and so interestingly they actually staged a walkout. Now, this is another dimension we can think about with the use of technology in schools, is the importance of teacher judgment, teacher professional judgment. Teachers are professionals who know their students, who know where they're at, and devise curriculum accordingly to the questions that are being asked, to the interests of the students. You can't replicate that to the same degree with something that just puts you down a different pathway according to the answers you give on some quizzes. So there's professional concerns for us about the way in which some technology is being used, and as a way of trying to get around the professional judgment of teachers and actually position teachers as people who just are technical facilitators of something that's already been decided. Kristen's going to talk a bit more about that.
So probably a lot of you have heard of EdRollo. Did anyone have EdRollo in any of the schools that they were at? Yeah, or even you might have had it when you were at school. So it's an online publishing company basically that rolls out content using top senior teachers. This is just an ad from their website, and it talks about how they have 500 plus customers, and then they've got the logos or the crests of particularly high achieving schools. There's McKinnon in there, Caulfield Grammar, Scots College. Right, so these are schools that are using their product. So in terms of when we talk about teacher judgment and we talk about high stakes environments and we talk about top teachers giving this information to students, there starts to be this fear thing that comes in. So if people are thinking, well, over 500 schools are accessing this information, and look how well lots of these schools go, and lots of these teachers who are presenting are actually the chief examiners or highly regarded examiners in VCE subjects, people start to get panicky. And of course what that does is then it narrows the curriculum even further. So this is not a reason to not use EdRollo, but I think as teachers we need to be discerning about the way in which we use technology, especially these, published texts which are sort of rolled out as being the answer. Just further to that, on the left here is a page from the language analysis, Year 12 or Unit 3 and 4. The woman presenting there is a woman called Andrea Hayes, and Andrea Hayes has written, she's actually from our school, or she teaches at our school, but she writes for Cambridge. She's written a number of different textbooks. She's one of the discrepancy examiners in the English VCE marking, and she focuses particularly on language analysis. So she's very much within that VCAR world, examination of VCE, quite a player. And she has presented her unit on language analysis. So it becomes quite formulaic. Yeah? So if you have 500 schools looking at the way in which a very senior VCE examiner is suggesting that you approach the language analysis task, you have to be quite a brave teacher, perhaps, to say, well, we're not all doing it like that. There are lots of different ways of approaching this task. Yeah? So you can see how it can kind of narrow the enacted curriculum that we're presenting to our students or experiencing with our students. The second slide on the right there is just an example of the data that EdRollo gives us as teachers. So you can see down the side there's the student name, and then there are a whole lot of questions, and you've got red saying that they haven't done it or they've got it wrong, and then they've got green saying that that's correct. That's for biology, but they also do the same stats for English. So it really encourages a very kind of quiz-based, content-focused form of presenting information. And there's also another section in it which just tells you not whether or not your students got a task right or wrong, but whether or not your students have watched a particular video that you might have set for them. So I think that's also got repercussions in terms of what are we saying to our students that we are valuing. It's like, and here I like the bottom bit, without having to mark a single response if you don't want to, you'll receive detailed feedback on how students fare in practice exams or questions. I think that's an interesting message to send to teachers. You don't even have to mark anything and you'll still get data. You don't have to really know. You don't even have to know what questions those are, yeah, except to say, oh, you need to go back and have a look at 5 to 7. I find that concerns me, yeah, that idea, and also that thing that perhaps we're just saying it's important just that you do the work. If I can see that you've done it, then I'm happy, yeah, my job is done here. And like Fleur was saying as well, I've also heard of EdRollo being used in that the teacher will play the videos in class. So rather than being sort of a personalised learning tool that it's sort of marketed as, that students, you can teach it and then students can kind of check their knowledge at home, it's actually becoming the curriculum. It's what some teachers are using to present the VCE curriculum. So we talked about, Fleur talked about the fact that we also need to really make sure that we are presenting disciplinary perspectives on new media in English. Yeah? So just because we're using technology doesn't mean that we forget about all those really important things that we're teaching in English. So still looking at things like literacy and literary studies. We're looking at linguistics and discourse analysis. You can read the slides. But I also just wanted to have a look at the dot point of creative writing. So we can use technology, if we're wanting our students to be creative and we're wanting our students to engage in text, we can really use technology in a really interesting way through this technology. So we're not saying how do we use the iPad, yeah, we're saying how can we get our students to think creatively and how might they present that? Oh, they could use the iPad to do something.
So to conclude, one of the ideas that we've been signaling to you is this idea of affordances. And so we've given you sort of a snapshot of some of the ways in which we think about the technology in the classroom, some of the critiques that are out there, some of the issues, particularly around young people and mobile phones and packaged curriculum online. And we want to leave you with this idea of affordances. So a really interesting theorist who died just earlier this year called Günter Kress, he writes a lot about this idea of affordances in texts, and he says attention to the potentials and constraints of modes, as well as the interactions and learning resources, image, writing, moving image, speech, as well as attention to the potentials and constraints of media, the printed media, such as the textbook, or the electronic media, such as the web. So this is a really interesting idea of it's all media, like the textbooks are media, a slate and chalk is media, but they all have different opportunities and constraints embedded within them. And when we look at media, we think about what does this allow me to do? What does it not allow me to do? So it has that opportunity and constraint idea. If we see modes as resources for meaning making and identities and communities, modes have different affordances, potentials and constraints for making meaning. Now it's making meaning, we're in the business of that as English teachers, making meaning with and alongside our students, helping them make meaning. And so what it comes down to is if we're thinking about new media, what kind of meaning making do I want my students to be engaged with today? And then what kinds of texts and practices and technologies, including the pen, which is a technology, what kinds of texts, practices and opportunities and technologies do I put before them to enable that meaning to be made? So it comes down to pedagogy is actually it's a prior question to technology. So we see a lot of schools investing in technology, and then teachers have to come up with uses for a technology that the money's already been spent on. Whereas it might be more useful as professionals to be saying, what are the pedagogies, what are the learning opportunities and outcomes we want, and then from that we might select technologies. And it might be a mobile phone, it might be a camera, it might be a blog, it might be a 19th century novel. All of them are technologies that enable and constrain in different ways. And having that more nuanced perspective, rather than technology is bad or technology is all good, gives us a different way and a more professional way of entering the conversation as English teachers, which we trust that you will do, being the bright stars that you are.